Hi, welcome to Unit 20. Unit 20 is called Analyse Impacts of Sociological Factors on Clients, and you could say students instead of clients, so analyse impacts of sociological factors on students in community, work and services. And you must be asking yourself, what on earth is that all about? What are sociological factors? Well, sociological factors are factors from the community, from the student's social context that affect the student. And it could be things like education, health, it could be the remoteness, the location of where the students are, it could be the availability of work, it could be socio-economic factors, all of those sort of factors that impact on students. And the reason we want to identify these factors and analyse these factors is because if we can do that, we can better meet the needs of the students.
And the first part is about political structure. Different political structures define the relationship between a government and its people, who holds the power, and how the government's power is used. And that will help you with question 1. There's 3 types of political systems: authoritarianism, monarchy, and democracy. And that will help you with question 2. So let's just unpack these a little bit. And authoritarianism is where the people have no power or representation, so they don't have elections. They've got blind obedience to their leaders and few individual freedoms, and China is a bit like that. An extreme form of authoritarianism is totalitarianism. This is where all aspects of people's lives are controlled and where they can be threatened by means of terror, and North Korea is a little bit like that. So that was authoritarianism. Then we have monarchy, and there's 2 types of monarchies. There's an absolute monarchy, which is like a dictatorship where the king or queen has absolute power, absolute rule, and Saudi Arabia is like that. And then you have constitutional monarchies, and this is where the royal family or the king or the queen has powers, but they are defined or often restricted by a constitution. And so England is like that, the UK, and so is Australia. So that was monarchy. And then we have democracy. And this is a system of government that is determined by the whole population, where they vote directly or they vote through representatives. And we often think of the United States as democracy. This slide here is interesting. It ranks countries by how democratic they are. And you'll see up the top it's got Norway, Iceland and Sweden as being the most democratic countries. We are at number 9, and I think America is about 12 or 13. The political structure in Australia is a democracy. So we have free and competitive elections, and you can be a member of a political party and you can take part in elections. But it's also a constitutional monarchy because it's a country that has a queen as its head of state. And the queen is formally represented by the Governor-General, but in practice the queen plays no part in Australian politics and is really a figurehead. And this will help you with question 3. The Governor-General is appointed by the Queen on the recommendation of Australia's Prime Minister, and they're not subject to direction from the Queen or the British government. They only act on the advice of ministers in most situations. And so that's a federal, or the Commonwealth Governor-General. We have 6 state Governor-Generals who perform that role in their states. In the Northern Territory, the Administrator performs that role, and in the ACT and other territories such as Cocos Islands, the Governor-General performs that role. The National Parliament has 2 chambers, the House of Representatives, or the lower house, the Senate and the upper house. They're both responsible for national laws such as trade, taxation, immigration, etc., and legislation has to be approved by both houses before it becomes law. The House of Representatives initiates most legislation. They currently have 150 elected members, each representing about 80,000 voters across Australia. And the political party with the most seats forms the government. The Senate is known as a House of Review. So proposed legislation is reviewed by the Senate and often referred on to committees. The original role was to ensure that laws were fair to all states. There's 12 senators from each state and 2 senators from each of the 2 territories, ACT and the Northern Territory. So question 4 asks about how you are represented. If you're from the territory, for example, you will be represented by 2 senators and also a federal minister. This is for the federal parliament. And if you are from one of the states, you're represented by 12 senators plus a House of Reps person as well. State and territory governments are responsible for those powers not administered by the Commonwealth. They have their own parliaments and constitutions, and they are bound by the national constitution. All state parliaments other than Queensland have an upper and lower house. The parliament of each territory has only one house. So the territory and Queensland, they just have one house. They're responsible for matters including public health, education, roads, all of those sort of things. Police, law and order, that sort of thing. Then the third tier is local government. And there are approximately 900 local governments in Australia, and they are the responsibility of their state or territory. So local government responsibilities include town planning, supervision of building codes, looking after water, sewerage, drainage, all that sort of thing.
So that's the end of the section on political structure, and now we're going to have a look at economic structure. And you can imagine, if we're looking at the impacts of sociological factors on young people, economic factors are going to be very important. So we want to look at the different types of economic structures. The economic structure of a country will lie between the extremes of socialism, down here, and capitalism, so it'll lie between those extremes, and the extremes of a market economy over here and a planned economy. Most economies in the world are mixed economies, so they're a mixture of all of these and lie in between those. Socialism, down here, is a political economical philosophy where there's public ownership of the means of production and of the production and distribution, and these decisions are made by the government. Often individuals can rely on the state from everything from food to healthcare, so that's socialism. Capitalism, up the top, is an economic system where there's private or corporate ownership of assets, and investors, common people, are free to buy, sell, produce and distribute their goods, create wealth, and from that choose a lifestyle. A planned economy over here is where the government controls and regulates the production, distribution, prices, etc., while a market economy over here relies very much on the market forces of the day. So that's the stock markets and the supply and demand of the day. Mixed economies are economies which blend these different things, capitalism and socialism and market and planned economies. The economic structure in Australia is highly developed, but it's a mixed economy, and it's mostly driven by the markets. There are interventions, so the government does have interventions like the Reserve Bank, and they can intervene with the interest rate, make adjustments to the interest rate. We lean towards being a capitalist model, so we're certainly up this end, but we have wide-ranging social welfare programs which bring us down this way a little bit. So we're not totally up the top here, and we're not totally a market economy. We do have some small adjustments that can be made, but Australia, you'd put Australia over here somewhere in this mixed economy, and you can see that other countries would be at different places in this mixed economy. Just to recap on this second section on economic structure, the types of economic structure will lie between the extremes of socialism and capitalism and the other extremes of a market economy and a planned economy, with most economies in the world being mixed economies, and that will help you with question 5. Socialism is where the state owns a means of production and distribution, and where individuals can rely on the state for everything from food to healthcare. Capitalism is an economic system where there's private or corporate ownership, and where investors or people are free to buy, sell, produce and distribute goods and create wealth. A planned economy is where the government controls and regulates production, distribution, prices, etc. And a market economy is where decisions regarding investment, production, distribution are guided by market forces of supply and demand, like the stock market, for example. And that will help you with question 6. And most economies are a blend of market and planned economies. The economic structure in Australia is a highly developed mixed economy driven by the markets. The government can fine-tune the economy with interventions such as the Reserve Bank and interest rate adjustments. The economic structure leans towards a capitalist model, but has wide-ranging social welfare programs. So that's the end of the section on economic structure, and you should have completed up to assessment question 7. Now we're going to have a look at social and cultural institutions. And you might ask, what are institutions? Social and cultural institutions. When most people think of an institution, they think of the large formal institutions such as the High Court or the Catholic Church. But the idea or the concept of an institution is much broader. We define an institution like this. They're the patterns of behaviour and structures of social order that govern the behaviour of people within a community. These patterns of behaviour or habits are stable and they've usually been around for a long time. They're valued by the community, so they keep them and they continue to occur. So that's how we define institutions, and that will help you with question 8. There are 3 types of institution: formal, informal or primary. Formal institutions include things like the Australian Parliament, the Catholic Church, the Education Department, and these are usually maintained by the relevant authority or the relevant people. Informal institutions are social order and organisations such as culture, habits, customs and individual experiences. These are generally unwritten social rules, norms and traditions. And then we have primary institutions, which can include many other institutions, formal and informal. So primary institutions include the family, the government, the economy, education, money, marriage, religion, those sort of things. If you look at the institution of money, for example, that includes formal organisations including banks, treasury departments, stock exchanges, which are institutions, as well as informal institutions or individual experiences such as purchasing items, investing, gaining wealth, that sort of thing, that guide people in their pursuit of personal well-being. So we've got 3 types: formal, informal and primary. That'll help you with question 9. Question 10, we've got a lot of major social and cultural institutions in Australia, including the Australian Parliament, the Catholic Church, the High Court, and you can see them here. Question 10 asks you to list 3 of these and to write down the purpose of them. And the purpose is generally fairly obvious. So the health system in Australia is to maintain the health of the Australian population, to educate people about health issues and so on. So there's some of the major social and cultural institutions in Australia. Institutions have purposes generally. So the purpose of an aged care system is to care for and support aged people. The church is to support people in their faith, and so on and so forth. But sometimes institutions can have a negative or an adverse impact on a young person. And we've got some examples here. Educational institutions. Some people just don't fit in educational institutions, and so they can have an adverse effect on them. And this will help you with question 11, the next 3 slides. They don't fit into the system, they've got a different learning style, they may engage with the institution but have less favourable outcomes, they might be bullied or cyberbullied, they might be negatively influenced by peers, etc. Negative influences in the Institute of Education can lead to lots of poor outcomes, including reduced employment outcomes and lower incomes. Another are health institutions. The institution that's a health system might be effective for young people living in cities and large towns, but for young people in rural or very remote communities, the same level of healthcare is not available. Or legal institutions. Nearly half of Australian young people experience at least one legal problem in a 12-month period, and legal problems can impact negatively on the life areas of these young people. That's the end of the section on social and cultural institutions, and now we want to have a look at social policy, and this is a very important part of this unit. Social policy is government policy that covers everything from social security right through to education and lots of other things in between, and this unit will look at social policy over time, the history of social policy in Australia, and what drives changes to social policy. Social policy. How do we define social policy, and this will help you with question 12. Social policy is the study of decisions of government that contribute to the well-being of the population generally and of individuals, and it's in areas such as social security, welfare, disability, health, education, employment services, Indigenous peoples, community services and child protection. It also includes values and ideas that underpin policy and the impact of policy on areas such as equity, fairness and social justice. So that's social policy, how we define social policy. Social policy in Australia differs very much from other countries. It's proven to be remarkably strong or robust since it started a century ago. Some sections, such as health insurance, are developed in the private sector, usually under legislation with financial support from the government. Social policy in Australia maximises economic and social participation, and this has always been a cornerstone of the Australian system. Australian social welfare tends to be confined to Australian citizens, and that's very much the same around the world. When we look at the history of social policy in Australia, it commenced in 1908 with legislation establishing the old age pension, and so you've got to remember that 1908 is 7 years after Federation, so it's a very new government, and so this is a big step for them. And this pension commenced in 1909, and we just look here at three of the very early milestones of social policy. In 1909 we had the old age pension. In 1910 we had invalid pension for people with disabilities. 1912 we had maternity allowance, and maternity allowance has continued in one form or another ever since, and this should help you with question 13. We have a little bit of a look at the history of social policy in Australia, and if we look at post-war Australia, after the war, after the Second World War, there was very strong economic growth. There was immigration for agriculture and mining, but the Australian society was very traditional. It was focused on white Australians and bringing white Australians in to help agriculture and mining. Men worked in farms and mines and factories, and women raised children. The poor and the unemployed were expected to get a job, and it was a time of prosperity and opportunity. Australians tended to adopt the culture of other countries, or to value the culture of other countries rather than their own culture, and particularly the culture of England and also of America as well. There tended to be a bit of a cultural cringe about our own culture. But everything changed with Gough Whitlam, particularly social policy. Traditional Australian society was completely changed forever by the Whitlam government, and the difference was an Australian identity, a new independence and a sense of pride. And there were a lot of different things that Gough Whitlam changed, and I want to go through some of them, some of the social change. One was recognition of Aboriginal land rights, then the replacement of royal honours and knighthoods by the Order of Australia, the abolition of the gerrymander or unfair voting, Medibank for universal health insurance, race removed as a criteria for immigration, Asia became the main source of new migrants, and Australia was introduced to a whole new level of multiculturalism. The Commonwealth had an expanded role in schools, universities, roads, arts and the environment. They took tertiary education back from the states, and they pumped huge sums of money into government schools. In 3 years, the spending on health and education quadrupled from 1.2 billion to 4.7 billion, which is pretty amazing. Other social change included homosexuality was no longer a crime. The Family Law Act introduced to make divorce easier. Single mothers were allowed to claim welfare benefits. Unemployment benefits were just $10 a week in 1972 and was lifted to the pension level, and the pension was raised as well. Women were granted equal pay for equal work, and the government took up an active feminist agenda. The National Gallery was built, and $1.1 million, which was a huge sum of money in those days, was spent buying Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, which was a very large and quite famous painting. The Australian Council was established to fund artists, and the Australian Film Commission to finance the film industry. So you can see that huge change that just happened in a few short years. All of this social change came very rapidly and was met with very strong antagonism from many Australians, including people like my parents, who were rather dismayed at so much change so quickly. So we no longer had full employment. We now had a national debt, quite a large national debt. There was higher inflation. Women were working, not just in their homes, looking after kids. And the government now supported millions of people. But Australia had a new independence and a new pride in itself, a pride in its own culture. After Gough Whitlam, we had Malcolm Fraser, and he maintained many of the social reforms of the Whitlam era. He established the Human Rights Commission, introduced the 5 international human rights instruments, introduced Commonwealth Ombudsman in 1977 and freedom of information laws. Then we had Bob Hawke, and he introduced active society measures to limit the growth of poverty and equality, and to kind of actively reduce poverty and protect those most vulnerable people in society. It's interesting that Australia appears to have become a more equal or fairer society over those years from 1981 to 1994. Then we had Paul Keating, and his social policy included reconciliation with Australia's Indigenous people, furthering economic and cultural ties with Asia, establishing ANTA, the Australian National Training Authority, the Creative Nation Scheme. He reviewed the Sex Discrimination Act, and then after Mabo, he administered the native rights of Australia's Indigenous people. Then we had John Howard. John Howard was in for quite a long time, I think 11 years. He promoted the traditional family. He was opposed to multiculturalism at the expense of a shared Australian identity, or that shared Australian culture. He was an interesting fellow because he was an economic radical, unlike previous Liberals, but he was a social conservative. He negotiated a motion of reconciliation with Aboriginal people. He amended Australia's superannuation law to allow same-sex couples to inherit their partner's private sector superannuation, and he defined marriage, the union of man and woman, to the exclusion of all others, and he brought that into the Marriage Act, the Family Law Act. So that was John Howard. After that we had Kevin Rudd. And we had Kevin Rudd twice, as you'll remember. He initiated the apology to Aboriginal people, and that's probably what he's really remembered for. The funding of Aboriginal outstation housing, greater recognition of LGBT rights in Australia, reforms to the recognition of same-sex relationships in taxation, health, employment, superannuation, and he also made changes in aged care and other areas. Then we had Julia Gillard, 2010 to 2013. She brought in the Clean Energy Bill, modified asylum seeker policy. She brought in the mineral resource rent tax, the National Broadband Network. She increased school funding following the Gonski Review. And the thing I think that she'll really be remembered for is NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So they were social reforms from Julia Gillard. Then we had Tony Abbott, and Tony Abbott opposed same-sex marriage, and he also opposed embryonic stem cell research and euthanasia. He advocated for a reduction in the number of abortions, although he did support a woman's right to have an abortion. And he said this: government spending on a range of social programs, including education, health, housing, subsidised transport, social safety nets and retirement benefits, has reached an extraordinary level as a percentage of GDP. Basically, he was saying, we can't afford this anymore. And so he was wanting to wind some of this back. And so he brought in this spending cuts budget, and it was a really unfair budget. Treasury analysis some months later showed that the proposed spending cuts would cost an average of $842 a year for low-income households, while high-income households lost $71. So it was quite unfair. Then we had Turnbull. Turnbull continued the asylum seeker policy and practice. He increased education funding. He
made cuts to ABC funding, cuts to overseas funding. He was very strong on climate change and particularly emissions trading programs, and this is what brought him undone in the end. And he introduced same-sex marriage as part of a plebiscite. And then we come to the Morrison government social policy. The strong views on asylum seeker policy are quite well known, and this government were involved in the Medivac repeal late last year. More recently, Scott Morrison has announced a new approach to closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, but all of the social policy has been overshadowed by COVID-19 measures, and these measures are social policies, social actions to support Australians during the restrictions and the shutdowns because of the coronavirus. We want to look at what causes change to social policy in Australia, and this will help you with question 14. The reality is that the government of the day drives change to social policy, or they cause the change to social policy. Labor governments typically change social policy in Australia. They're the ones who change social policy. Liberal or coalition governments typically are more focused on financial issues, making sure the economy is working well. But some Labor governments have made significant financial changes, such as Keating with deregulation, and some Conservative governments have made significant social changes, such as Fraser with human rights, etc. There are some things that influence governments to change social policy, and this will help you with question 15. It could be a particular social agenda, like the ALP or the Greens. They have a particular social agenda. It might be developing practice in other countries. It could be lobbying from special interest groups, peak bodies, the church, groups such as that. It could be the results of opinion polls or elections, and we certainly saw that around the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd era. It could be individuals or community groups making representation. It might be individual incidents such as the Port Arthur massacre, which led to the gun control that we've got now, or the 9/11 attacks in the United States. It might be personal events in the lives of the politicians and leaders, or it could be a range of other possible triggers. But these are some of the things that influence governments to change social policy.
So that's the end of the section on social policy, and you can probably see how much change there has been in Australia from those post-war years through the very big changes through the Whitlam period, through all the Prime Ministers up to Scott Morrison, so lots of changes. That's also the end of video number 1 for Unit 20, and you should have completed up to assessment question 15. Thank you.